Well, my love and interest in wildlife started about the same time I started writing, actually, when I was about 6. Um, I loved any kind of book I could get about wildlife, um, and then also when I was 6, I learned what extinction was, and I remember saying to my parents, like, "These species are gone forever? They're never coming back, and we're responsible for that?" Like, I think when I was real little, like 4, I thought, "Oh, extinction," I think of dinosaurs that lived millions of years ago, and it was a real awakening for me to realize, no, this is happening now and we're causing it. And after that, I became just dedicated to doing everything I could to help wildlife. I remember I started this little organization in elementary school. I called it STES, which was short for Save the Endangered Species. And I would, like, rope my friends into doing chores for people, and we would get money from that, and then we'd pool the money together and donate it to, like, Greenpeace or Defenders of Wildlife. We would sell things door to door. I remember selling coffee out of my Muppet Show thermos to people for 25 cents a cup, and, um, I would paint driveway rocks gold and sell them as, like, genuine gold nuggets for 25 cents. So that started really young, and as I got older, I was, circulating petitions and things like that. I would ride my bike down to the local wildlife rescue center and muck out raccoon cages and stuff. And so then when I got into college, it was a hard decision between the arts, which I loved. I'd been writing and working with wildlife as long as each other, so I decided to do both. So my both of my degrees, my undergrad and graduate, are a mix of creative stuff like writing, screenwriting, and then field zoology, wildlife biology, biogeography, and things like that. So the worlds were always separate, though. I would write, and then I do wildlife research. I do mainly species presence surveys, which is where I'll go to a parcel of land usually protected by a land trust, and I'll set out remote cameras and bioacoustic recorders to see what species are using the property. And that allows us to know what kind of habitat we should improve and um, where we can improve that land. So, and sometimes we find endangered species there, which is exciting. So it was actually out on a survey in Montana. We were looking for wolverines and wolves, and I was setting up about a acoustic recorder, and I thought, why aren't I writing about this? Up until then, I'd written a lot of horror and some science fiction, some sci-fi actually. And I thought, why aren't I doing this for a book? And one of my favorite things to read is science thrillers. And I thought, well, this is just a shoe-in for that. I'm in this remote place. It's like really isolated. And why don't I have a character who's a wildlife biologist who travels around to different protected parcels of land and is looking for species that are endangered, but meanwhile, she could get into all kinds of dangerous situations. And it just felt so right. I was so excited. I went back to camp that night, and I immediately started figuring out who she was and where her first adventure should be. And because I was in Montana at the time, I thought, well, how about Montana? And how about wolverines? Because they're really threatened. There's only 300 or so left in the lower 48. So I really wanted to address their plight, but also tell a suspenseful tale with a really likable protagonist. So that's how Alex Carter came to be. I picked the endangered species first, and I've been doing ones that are the most endangered. So, like wolverines, like I mentioned earlier, there's less than 300 left here. And and then polar bears, of course, like I said, they could all vanish soon. And with the mountain caribou, we used to have herds all over the Rockies and in the Cascades, and they were being hunted in a non-sustainable way. But also the problem with caribou, they have a lot of threats against them. One is they rely on old growth forests because they survive throughout the winter on this tree hanging lichen. So, and it takes many decades for this lichen to grow in the trees. And they need tall snowpack as well so that they can stand on the snowpack and pull the lichen down. So between global warming, meaning the snowpack's a lot lower, and these forests being decimated, they don't have that tree hanging lichen. But also there's logging roads. allow wolves to come into the terrain where they normally wouldn't be in these really high altitude locations where the mountain caribou live. But with these logging roads, the wolves can just use the roads to get in. And also, the newer forests that grow in the place of these old growth forests are the moose and elk and deer species will move into these younger forests. And that's what wolves normally prey on. They don't normally prey on caribou. So as their prey moves and they follow their prey, suddenly now they're mixed in with caribou, and they don't have a predator-prey relationship with caribou. For example, like, if wolves are feeding on moose, the moose population goes down, and that makes the wolf population go down. So then the moose population rebounds, and then the wolf population rebounds, and there's this balance. But they don't have that relationship with caribou because they're mainly eating these other species, so they can decimate a caribou population, but that doesn't make the wolf population go down. So there's a number of species or a number of problems humans are causing that are eliminating the mountain caribou. And they were protected under the Endangered Species Act, but there's a long process involved there. I mean, first they have to decide that they're even going to list a species. Then they have to come up with a recovery plan and designate critical habitat and begin the recovery process. Well, that was majorly delayed with the mountain caribou, and they dwindled and dwindled and dwindled until the US had 2 left, and they were both females. So Canada took them and incorporated them into their herd. So now we have no mountain caribou in the lower 48, which is really sad. So I knew that I wanted to address that, and in the book, um, Alex thinks that they've gotten perhaps an image of a mountain caribou on one of these remote cameras that's stashed around. So, of course, if there is one there, that's a huge deal, and the land trust definitely wants to find out if it's there. I talked to a lot of experts. I'd feel a little awkward coming up to a ranger. So about being murdered out, but I always try to, get the investigative agencies right and things like that. And it is, being a backcountry ranger, it is such a lonely, remote job. And there's that famous case, of course, of Randy Morgenstern, who disappeared in Kings Canyon, Sequoia, who was a backcountry ranger. And that always fascinated me, that case. So she's not the one investigating the murders. They're more of like a action thrillers. So it's more like, how is she going to get out of this situation rather than a traditional whodunit. So she's just trying to go about her day, trying to find these species and navigate through the wilderness. But then when these dangerous situations do occur, like she comes upon a dead body, usually, it impacts her study in some way. So while the sheriff is still investigating, or law enforcement ranger or what have you is investigating the actual crime and doing, the forensics and the postmortem and everything, Alex is going on about her study, but whatever's happening there that caused those murders is tied in with her studies and therefore continues to impact her. So she has to get out of these dangerous situations where, she's seen too much, or she's stumbled on something that is going to expose someone's nefarious activities. So in my next book, The Vanishing Kind, it's set in New Mexico, and I chose jaguars again because they're so critically endangered. Right now they used to roam all over the Southwest US, and colonists actually reported seeing them even in places like Ohio. So there we had a lot of jaguars. Unfortunately, they've been hunted to near extinction, and right now, we think we have one left that's crossing the border between Mexico and Arizona. There might be more. There's cameras set up, a network of them to detect jaguars. So there might be more moving back and forth, but we're just not seeing them. But they used to be in New Mexico. And again, it was the same situation where they were listed under the Endangered Species Act, but there was so many delays with the recovery plan and critical habitat being designated. In fact, critical habitat was finally designated in Arizona and New Mexico, but there were so many complaints in New Mexico that they actually removed that critical habitat. So it's just in Arizona at this point. So I thought, "Well, I really wanna address that this is a species that this is its natural habitat." And, my best friend and I again did a, jaguar presence survey on a preserve in New Mexico, so we were out there, we had recorders out in case we could hear jaguars and, remote cameras, and we were also looking for endangered bats and birds and things like that. And, and it was just such again, such a remote setting, and one thing there's a lot of discussion now about the border wall and how it should look and how far it should expand. And the thing about those 30-foot tall steel pedestrian walls is that it doesn't just keep humans out, it keeps wildlife out. And the problem with that is things like wolves and jaguars, they need to be able to cross to new habitat to find mates, to find new sources of food. And if they're all jammed up in one area, they can start to suffer from genetic isolation from inbreeding. So I thought, well, there's a great example of how Alex's work, wanting to are there jaguars on this preserve? And if so, what can we do to improve their ability to cross back and forth is gonna, of course, meet with a lot of, um, resistance from certain groups of people, like anti-immigrant, vigilantes. And so I just thought it was a great dynamic place to set a book. I feel like I know Alex really well, like, I feel like I could hang out with her. Um, and I think we're similar in a lot of ways, at least with our dedication to help wildlife, um, and I wanted her to be really resourceful. I read a lot of these science thrillers, and I'm often disappointed with how the women are portrayed in them. And they're usually there just to kinda hook up with the male lead, and their profession, if they have one, is, like, tertiary, and so I really wanted Alex to be this strong, resourceful, be able to think and fight her way out of situations. She knows a martial art, which I studied too, so hopefully I can bring that accuracy to it. And she knows because she was in college and was a broke college student, she learned how to fix her own car so she can tinker with machines, um and her mother was an Air Force pilot, so she used to play all these survival games with Alex. So she grew up like her mom would drop her off in the woods, and Alex would have to figure out how to get back, and she would, say, "Well, okay, Alex, what if you're in this situation? What do you have on hand? What can you use as a weapon?" And so just as a kid even, and that's when she started to learn martial arts as a kid, and she just started to gain all these skills, so she's really competent out in the field and isn't defined by her relationships with other people.